necessarily always able to publish about the story. And we also met at that time in June with government officials. In addition, we met with, we had access to court documents and the reports of medical examiners, government medical examiners, when the detainees had been referred for medical exams pursuant to their claims of having been subjected to torture. This too is, I think, I really want to underscore the fact that back in the 90s, when I first started doing this work, there were no medical reports. I don't even think there were exams, but we certainly didn't have access to those kinds of reports. We didn't have access to the court documents. So this too is an indication that there's certainly we're not saying that Bahrain has gone back to square one. That's not my view in any case. What we are saying is that when it comes to the issue of torture, which is extremely important because, well, it's a very serious offense, number one, and number two, because of Bahrain's own political history in having been a state that routinely practiced torture and then ending torture and then see it revived again requires some urgent action, we think, on the part of the governments. Let me now turn the microphone over to Josh, who will walk us through, again, very quickly, because we do want to get to your questions. So those are our main findings, and then I'll come back and talk a bit about very briefly about the recommendations we have, mainly to the government of Bahrain. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Abdullah. A moment before I came up here, I was reminiscing with Nabil Rajab, whom I think probably every single person in Bahrain knows, so I won't bother to identify him, about the fact that the first ever press conference we held regarding Guantanamo detainees was just upstairs from here about 5 years ago. So it's nice to be back in familiar setting. It's unfortunate, of course, that we're here to talk about a different yet also grim subject. We found during the course of our investigation that a particular series of interrogation techniques that constitute torture or perhaps otherwise illegal treatment have been employed by Bahraini security forces in the cases that Joe mentioned. These techniques, by and large, were used at CID headquarters in Adliya. That's the General Directorate of Criminal Investigation. They were also employed to a lesser degree at the Dry Dock Detention Center, as well as at National Security Agency headquarters at the Manama Police Fort. In particular, what we found is that security forces have suspended the bodies of detainees in the air, most typically by raising detainees' arms and hands above their head and lifting their bodies off the ground. We found that security forces have used electroshock devices against detainees, most typically stun guns, at least based on the description of the devices that we received from detainees. We found that security forces have beaten the soles of the feet of detainees, a technique referred to many as falaka. We also found that security forces have inflicted what could be described as general beatings on detainees, which constitute anything from slaps to punches to kicks. It appears that these techniques were not used simply to satisfy some sadistic impulses on the part of security officials. Rather, they were employed during interrogations or just before or just after interrogations, but during the interrogation process. It seems clear that the techniques were used to elicit confessions. In the Jidhoff's case that Joe mentioned, the question was always, where is the gun? meaning the gun that allegedly was stolen from a police vehicle during a protest in Jidhas. With respect to the Al Bujera case that Joe mentioned, the question was always, where are the bombs? And tell us about your training in Syria. So these were the inquiries that we heard about over and over as being put to detainees while the techniques that I just described were being used. We know that these techniques were in fact successful in eliciting confessions. In the Karzakhan case, which Joe mentioned and which we'll discuss more fully later, according to the government, 18 of 19 detainees confessed to being fully involved in an incident of an assault on a police vehicle that allegedly resulted in the death of an NSA officer. So, in our view, there's nothing accidental about the use of these techniques. There's nothing random about it. Rather, these techniques were used for very specific purposes. That is, to secure confessions that would later be used in court. Certainly, while some of the techniques are difficult to hide, there were also efforts, it appears, on the part of security forces to reduce the visible signs of injury that could have resulted from the use of those techniques. I'll discuss that in a bit more detail in a moment. How did we conclude that this is what has been going on for the last several years? Well, as Joe mentioned, we interviewed 20 detainees, most of former detainees, most of whom were released as a result of the King's Decree last spring. Crucially, we also relied to a substantial degree on medical reports that were created by government doctors and that provided very strong corroboration of the testimonies that we heard. Well, let's discuss the testimonies first and the reasons why we found them to be credible. The former detainees were very consistent in their testimony with respect to the types of interrogation techniques used, that is, those I just described. We didn't have a situation where one former detainee said, I was waterboarded, and another one reported that his thumbnails had been pulled off. No, we kept hearing about the same set of interrogation techniques. Moreover, the testimony that we heard was very consistent with respect to the manner in which those techniques were implemented. For example, when people talked about being suspended in the air, many of them described how pieces of cloth would be wrapped around their wrists before handcuffs were applied to their wrists and before they were lifted off the ground, in what appears to be an effort to reduce the sort of scarring or injuries that you might expect to see when somebody's body is essentially being supported by their wrists. When people talked about the use of electroshock devices, they said that in general, these devices were only applied for an instant and then taken off. Well, we know that when you apply a stun gun for more than a few seconds, it tends to incapacitate the victim. Obviously, that's not something that you want to do when you're interrogating someone. With respect to these devices, we also heard very consistent testimony that they left temporary black marks on people's bodies. That we also know is a typical result of the use of a stun gun that can be seen quite frequently. The former detainees also spoke to us in very consistent terms about the general strategy of the interrogation session, even when it came to techniques that would not be described as illegal. It was very common for security officials to put a photograph of a demonstration in front of a detainee, point to